All right, this is part 4 of Module 4, Reagan and America. We have, in this module, moved through the 60s and 1970s, and now we're going to finish this module with the 1980s, which is a big decade with a lot of change, a lot of reaction to what's been going on in the 1960s and 1970s. Note that you have two potential terms here, so make note of those before we continue. And then let's talk about Ronald Reagan and the election of 1980. Now, as we've been leading up to, in 1980, we are ready for something different in the United States. We were having a lot of fun in the 1960s at first with all of the drugs and the drinking and the freedom and the sex and the music and all of the fun stuff that we think about when we think of the 1960s. But as we get into the 1970s, we start to think that maybe all of that destabilized our country and sent us down this path of ruin as we face economic instability, political instability, foreign policy instability, cultural instability. Everything's become radicalized, and all of these groups are up in arms, and the country seems to be falling apart. And so Nixon actually began this move more toward conservatism with his election and then his complete disaster of a second term that ended in his resignation. And here in 1980, we will see this culmination of this backlash to elect a president, Ronald Reagan, on a very different, very conservative, very traditional platform. In the election of 1980, this is the electoral map that shows Carter versus Reagan. The red states are Reagan, and the green states are Carter. And you can see that there was a massive vote for Reagan. This picture is not important. I just think that that's a really fun hat. Reagan's message was that we have it in our power to begin the world over again. And this is exactly what people wanted to hear. They wanted a reset button. They wanted a new America. They wanted a new America that looked like the old America that they were idealizing from the 1950s. He was an affable, hopeful, excellent speaker who was really able to connect with the audience, partially because of his background in acting. He's going to bring about this return of conservatism. He's going to be anti-ERA. He's going to be anti-busing. And if that's confusing, what that refers to is the process of forced government desegregation in the South, where they would bus Black students into white schools to promote desegregation more quickly. And it wasn't that Reagan was anti-segregation or anti-desegregation. Not that. He just didn't believe the government should be overseeing it. He believed that it should be in the hands of the states. He was anti-affirmative action for the same reason. Affirmative action is a government program designed to create better opportunity for African Americans by forcing regulations on businesses that said you have to have a certain number of minority employees in order to be in compliance with the law. Reagan would say that's too much power in the hands of the government. He's anti-welfare, again, because of too much power in the hands of the government. He wants to take the country back to a state of deregulation, of small, limited government, and conservative, traditional, and yes, religious values. He's also going to be anti-gay rights. He's going to actively promote the fact that he's religious. He's going to be more traditional in almost every way. One of the things that Reagan does that he's sort of most known for is the implementation of something that we call Reaganomics, which is not the real name for it. We call it Reaganomics like we call it Obamacare, right? It's named after the president that promotes it, even though Obamacare is really the Affordable Health Care Act. So Reaganomics is basically trickle-down economics, which is the idea that you reduce the tax rate on the wealthiest people in the country. So the people who are in the top 5% or the top 1% of earners in the country, they were being taxed at a pretty high rate. And so he reduced it from 70% of their income to 50% and then to 28% of their income. And the theory here is that by lowering taxes on these big-time businessmen, these very wealthy people, that it would allow those businesses to produce more jobs and it would allow the rich to invest more money in the economy, and all of that extra money that they were getting would eventually trickle down into the hands of the middle class and into the hands of the lower class. And that it was a type of deregulated aid to the lower class and the middle class by allowing the upper class to have more money to use wisely. Now, this may seem like it's going to work really well on paper, and a lot of people credit Reaganomics for some of the prosperity that we felt during the 1980s. But the problem with Reaganomics is that it relies upon the wealthy, the business owners, to act in a certain way. If those business owners and the wealthy do act in that way, then yes, Reaganomics or trickle-down economics can work. But in the 1980s, rather than investing, rather than creating new jobs, the new richest of the rich spent their money on luxuries, technology, real estate, buyouts. Basically, they used it to buy a bunch of fun things. They bought new houses. They invested in real estate. They bought out other companies, but they didn't necessarily do a lot, at least not enough, to create jobs. And so what we see during the 1980s is actually a recreation of the Gilded Age, where you have very, very rich people who are getting richer and very, very poor people who actually are getting poorer. The middle class stays about the same throughout the 1980s, and the lower class actually gets poorer. And so trickle-down economics, while it could potentially work, does not work in the 1980s. But we do have a return to prosperity in the 1980s, largely because there was some stimulation of the economy through Reaganomics, absolutely, but largely because Carter's very unpopular policies about high investment rates were doing their job and helping to regulate the health of the economy, even though people hadn't liked it. And most of the credit will go to Reagan for his Reaganomics policies. There will be a great deal of social conservatism throughout the 1980s. People are wondering if political liberalism is to blame for the decline in family values. People feel like families are falling apart. There's an increase in drug use, there's an increase in teenage pregnancy, there's an increase in the divorce rate. And they blame the culture of the 1960s and 1970s for that. And so there's a resurgence of quote-unquote Christian principles. We want to remove education and sex education from the classroom because they believe that sex education promotes sexual activity amongst teenagers. They want to bring prayer back into the classroom. There's a lot of sexual conservatism. There's a lot of opposition for abortion. During the 1970s, Roe v. Wade had legalized abortion. Now in the 1980s, we're very against that. We want to reverse that decision. There's a limitation of family planning, meaning that a lot of conservatives don't want access to birth control or abortion as well, or anything that is going to promote in their minds irresponsible sexuality. And there's a great deal of concern over the toleration of homosexuality. The AIDS epidemic will begin in the 1980s, and that scares the nation, especially because it's originally associated with homosexuality. And it's not understood that it can be passed between any two people who are sexually involved. And so they believe that this is condemnation on the country for tolerating homosexuality. And there's also concern over immigration. This has been a constant theme in the United States history. We're concerned that immigrants are going to come to the United States and bring these very dangerous ideas with them. And so social conservatives will really take hold in the 1980s and try to promote a religious-based, family values-based culture once again. Now, Reagan in the Cold War, this is a very important aspect of his presidency. As Reagan takes office, we are concerned because of the 1970s that we've lost our standing in the world, because we couldn't overcome the oil crisis, because we couldn't get the hostages back from Iran, and we worry that people aren't taking America seriously. And so Reagan comes into office with this highly aggressive attitude, especially in terms of how he spoke about the Soviet Union. He called them the evil empire. He said the United States would make war on them. He said the United States was going to take them down, that they would use all of this rhetoric, so much rhetoric and such intense rhetoric. People were worried that his words alone would start a war between the United States and the Soviet Union. He will implement new programs like the Strategic Defense Initiative, which is sort of nicknamed Star Wars, where he tried to launch lasers into space that he could set off, aimed at the Soviet Union. That if the Soviet Union attacked us, then we could trigger these satellites in space that would launch our own nuclear weapons. That's never going to work. It's going to be very expensive, and it's not ever going to actually happen. He will engage in the largest military buildup in American history. And this is a problem because as we're pouring money into the military and feeling better about our power levels, we're spending a lot of money. And at the same time, he's cut taxes. And so our income is decreased while our spending is increased. And that results in Ronald Reagan increasing the national debt by 189% during his presidency. Now, every president will increase the debt since or from that point. George H.W. Bush by 55%, Clinton by 37%, George W. Bush by 86%, and Obama at the point that this chart was made, Obama was still in office, and at that point he had increased the debt by 35%. Now, there's a lot of factors that you have to account for in there. This is a very generic chart, but it demonstrates consistently that Republican presidents are increasing the debt more than Democratic presidents, even though we typically associate government spending with Democrats. But that's because of military spending, which has started here with Ronald Reagan. Now, despite the fact that Ronald Reagan is taking a very aggressive approach to the Cold War, the opposite is happening over in the Soviet Union when Mikhail Gorbachev takes power in 1985. And Mikhail Gorbachev is a young, I know he doesn't look young to you, but he's a lot younger than any of the leaders in the Soviet Union for the past many years, and he recognizes that the Soviet Union is beginning to fall apart from the inside out, and he needs something to change. And so he initiates political openness, economic reform in glasnost and perestroika. And he allows people to start being part of different political parties, and he tries to stimulate the economy. And he initiates negotiations with Ronald Reagan to reduce the arms race and to lessen the Cold War. But the most important thing that he does is he stops enforcing communistic governments in Europe. The Soviet Union has been, just like the United States has been enforcing non-communism, the Soviet Union has been enforcing communism, particularly in Eastern Europe. And Mikhail Gorbachev will say in 1985, we just can't do that anymore. We don't have the resources. We don't have the desire. Everybody make their own decisions. And basically, he kind of checks out of the Cold War. And so as a result, all of these protests will break out in Europe as these countries begin to overthrow the enforced communist governments. And all of this will lead to November 1989, when the protests reached the famous Berlin Wall, which is the one major symbol of the Cold War. And protesters will tear it down, allowing Germany to reunify under a non-communist government, and communism will fail throughout Europe. Ultimately, in 1991, the Soviet Union will break apart into 15 different nations, largely because of the openness and the reforms that Mikhail Gorbachev initiated in the country in the late 1980s. And so all of a sudden, the Cold War is over between 1989 and 1991. It just ends mostly because Mikhail Gorbachev basically says, look, we're not going to play this game anymore. Now, some people will say that it was Ronald Reagan's aggressive stance that caused him to do that Mikhail Gorbachev was intimidated by Ronald Reagan's commitment to the Cold War and our military buildup, and he knew he couldn't compete, so he backed out. And other people will say that while the United States was still trying to promote war, Mikhail Gorbachev he was the bigger man and said, look, we're going to call it quits on this. Either way, the Cold War ends in the 1980s, and Ronald Reagan gets a great deal of that credit. In fact, the Ronald Reagan statue in Washington, D.C. has a little piece of the Berlin Wall in it as a symbol of his influence on the end of the Cold War. And so on the whole, what we get from the 1980s is this return to social conservatism, a change in our economic structure, the end of the Cold War, and really the grounding of the conservative movement in the United States. It's going to pave the way for a lot of the developments in the 1990s, and that is a topic for the next module.